Hello and welcome to the Bluff Creek Project Podcast. I am Tate Hieronymus. I'm your host, and I'm joined by my co-host, Robert Leiterman. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I'm in my usual spot again. I'm out in the back where it's like quieter, better reception, and it's not raining right now, so it might start up again. I mean, all over the country, it's been raining and snowing, but here on the West Coast, I guess this kind of starts here and moves this way. But we're looking good.
Yeah, it's pretty cloudy here today, but oh well. So I got a great guest for us, Robert. We got Jeff Meldrum on here.
Excellent.
How are you doing, Jeff?
Good. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us and taking some time out of your schedule to talk to a couple of goofy guys like us.
Oh, it's great. Pleasure. Always fun to explore the topic a little further, different angles.
Exactly. And that's why I like doing it. It's so much fun that way. So Robert, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start out. Well, Jeff, it's really good to see you. I remember first meeting you at a conference. I guess it was in the Yakima. You gave a talk there, and that's when we first met. I don't expect you to remember that. It's so long ago. And when we were doing the Bluff Creek Project, and it was 2012, you're one of the guys we invited up. It was I can't remember, brains going. There was Daniel Prince was there. You got to help me there.
I don't think I was present for that particular one.
No.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you weren't. But we invited you. But some family emergency came up, and you had to cancel out. That was back in 2012.
Yeah, that could well.
It was Bill Munns is the other name I was trying to think. Bill Munns, Perez, and yourself were invited, but something came up, and you had to cancel on that. That was in 2012 in the summer for our big blowout, and we still want to get you up to the film site, to show it to you.
Yeah, definitely. I was there once. Excuse me, for the event at the museum, that kickoff for the Titmus. Well, it wasn't the Titmus expansion, but it housed the Titmus collection, I guess you could say, much of that. But that was the only time I've had the opportunity to be at the film site and get a little sense of the lay of the land and changes that have occurred over the decades now. So, yeah, that would be great. I would jump at the opportunity. We can work it out.
Oh, that'd be great. I think back in 2003, that we call it the big confusion. That's when everybody came down looking for the film site, and that's when people weren't so sure where it was. In 2003, and you showed up for that as well.
If that was the one associated with the museum wing, that was the only time. And I don't know. I mean, it clearly at that point it was really overgrown with alders, and it was very difficult to get your bearings. I know that the stream bed had shifted quite a bit, and so the actual configuration of the sandbar and some of those landmarks was probably different than at the time of the filming. So I was basically just relying on the other people who were there, who had photos and were trying to triangulate, etc. Whether we actually got to the spot, I mean, obviously we were close, but whether we were on the spot or not, I couldn't say with confidence. But
yeah, that was. We always talk about that as the mass confusion of 2003. You could thank Stephen Stroifer for that term. That's what he calls it. I think Stephen was there. I wasn't there for the Sunday field trip. I was there for the salmon dinner. I did a guest spot there and did a tongue-in-cheek comedy act for on Bigfoot during the salmon dinner. That was on Friday, and then I had to go back to work because I was working for Parks. And I really wish I could stay those last 2 days for the conferences, but I couldn't.
Sure.
Yeah. So it's kind of cool. I'm pretty excited by having you here, on the podcast. And thanks so much for taking the time out in your busy day. Because I know, what is it, Mother's Day? I'm sorry, Valentine's Day. What am I talking about?
Valentine's Day, yeah.
Valentine's Day. So I had to clear with the boss first to make sure it was okay.
Well, I'm terrible with holidays and dates and birthdays and so forth. But we went out. We had our Valentine's dinner last night. Went out and had some steak and ribs and the works. It was little overindulgence, but
Yeah.
basically we fasted today just to make up for it.
Yeah, putting on the pants and the shoes, bending over to do that. Yeah, it's gonna take a couple days to get that, back into place there.
Right.
Oh, sweet. Yeah, we do have a few questions to ask you on that too, and
Great.
we like to ask our guests, how did it all start? What was that first thing that you experienced or saw or heard that got you excited about pursuing this crazy thing called
Right.
Bigfoot?
Yeah. Well, and I hope your listeners indulge me, because obviously this is the typical leadoff question. Sometimes I feel like they're hearing the same stories over and over again, but well, for me, I mean, and you really have to wind the clock back, obviously, because it was since we started talking about the Patterson Gimlin film site, it was the film. I can remember just as if it were yesterday, really. We were at school late into the evening because we were doing back then they had a program called, I think it was Gymkhana. It was an athletic program, but part of the program was you demonstrated the acquired skills to your parents with an evening program. And so classes were hovering there in our classrooms waiting for our opportunity to sprint down to the gym, and our parents could see us shoot baskets and tumble, etc. All that kind of simple stuff. I mean, I was in 5th grade at the time. And as we're sitting there twiddling our thumbs and waiting for our time, someone brought this topic up. There had been apparently an advertisement in the newspaper for this showing of this film about Bigfoot. And someone else in the classroom at home, they had a copy of the Reader's Digest issue with the Bigfoot article in it. And this was news to me. This was the first exposure to the concept of Bigfoot that I ever experienced. And I mean, it really kind of encapsulated so many things that intrigued me and were of interest to me, from paleontology and fossil prehistoric life and cavemen and human evolution and so forth. So I remember just being mesmerized listening to these stories, and then my parents, we had to stay through the whole program, but the parents kind of came in rotations, and they didn't really have capacity to accommodate all the parents at once. So mine were gone, which meant I had to sprint home in the dark, which was about 4 or 5 blocks was all. But this is up in Spokane, Washington, with all these towering ponderosa pines, and behind every tree trunk there was a Bigfoot lurking now, and it was a mad dash to get home. But once I was home, I raced over and grabbed the paper and opened it up, and there was that advert, and I immediately brought it to my dad's attention, and of course my younger brother was all interested, and we went to the showing the next day in the Spokane Coliseum. So that was really the start. That was really the exposure, and I really got in whole hog. They distributed newsletters after Roger introduced the film, and then he came out and fielded some questions from the audience, and on our way out they distributed these sample newsletters of the Northwest Research Association. And part of the introduction was an invitation to become a member of the Northwest Research Association. And membership brought with it, you could purchase a copy of his book. You could also purchase a replica cast. And it's interesting, this just came up. Well, actually, it's a little offset. The cast that I purchased that they offered was a really, actually a very poor quality acrylic, resin of one of the 2 casts that Roger made at the film site. And I had that for years and years. Unfortunately, used it as a prop for a documentary interview up in the foothills outside of Pocatello. And in the very cold temperature, we were, impressing some prints in the mud. And it was just cold enough that acrylic got a little brittle, and I cracked it. And forgot it up there. Anyway, I hate to admit this, but I forgot it. I actually had forgotten about this until just this story. But because there's another cast, I'll come back to that later. But and interestingly, 5x7 color print from the film, the 352 frame, or whichever numbering system you acknowledge, but everyone kind of knows it's the 352, and then a big 11x14 black and white full frame print of 352. And those are treasures. I mean, I still have those, and the quality is amazing. You know, yeah, it always galls me when I hear people say, "Oh, you know, it's so blurry. It's so it's really not of any use." So Dr. Daglin goes on and on about saying how blurry the film is, and really, and nothing can be gained from it. Well, he was clearly working from a very poor quality that Rene de Hinden supplied him with. And so some of the remarks and some of the things, I guess, could be understood given the quality. But boy, you look at these prints. I'm not sure how exactly they were done, whether they were, you know, whether a contact negative was created and then printed directly from that, or what. But I've shown blow-ups. I mean, if you take a high-res digital scan of this photographic print, the quality is just really quite stunning. Anyway, so I was into it, and then the following year we did a unit on primates in 6th grade. It was kind of interesting retelling this. I reviewed a book by Daniel Taylor, formerly Daniel Taylor Ide. Some people will know him from his first book, Hidden Behind the Ranges, and but he's dropped the hyphenation, just going by Daniel Taylor. And he wrote a very interesting book about the Yeti. He comes down on the side of it being more metaphorical than physical, but interesting when he tells his story. There's a remarkable parallel, which I pointed out in my review of his book. But for him, though, it wasn't the Patterson film. It was coming home and seeing the Daily Mail, or the London Times, or whatever it was. I think it was the Daily Mail that had blazoned on the cover the Shipton footprint of the Yeti. And he was about in the equivalent of 4th or 5th grade. And the next year he did a report on the Yeti in his classroom. And that really charged and kind of propelled his interest in the topic. But in 6th grade, we did a unit on primates, and it was an interesting twist and turn of how this came about. But I ended up being assigned to do my report on Sasquatch, and I'm thinking, how am I going? I mean, I had Roger's book, and I had started my own kind of collection of clippings and magazine articles, but I didn't have much to work with. And my teacher said, well, go talk to your librarian. That's your source. This is well before the days of the internet and Wikipedia and Google. But this was what the funniest turn of it was. It turned out that my librarian was John Green's niece.
Wow.
He had gotten literally weeks earlier a first printing copy, of his On the Track of the Sasquatch. But she also turns around behind her desk and pulls open a drawer. She had a clipping file of all different, topics for just such requests. And one of the manila folders she reached in and pulled out was just chock full of dozens of clippings of newspaper articles and magazine articles and different things on the subject. So that set the ball rolling. That was fun to discover. I mean, at the time I didn't know John Green or know that, she was his niece. It wasn't until I was in Harrison Hot Springs for my first public presentation on the topic, and due to a snafu at the hotel, there was no reservation for me, and they were booked solid. And so I'm sitting there, I kind of muttered under my breath, so can I camp on the beach? And I hear this voice behind me say, don't be ridiculous, and turn around, and there's John Green standing behind me. He said, you're going to come and stay with me. So I got to spend the weekend at John's house with John Bindernagel as well as the other house guests. So that was just a fantastic sort of inauguration into the Bigfoot community. And it was during that, evening conversation, John was kind of pressing me, because he was dismayed. How was it that I seemed to have so much depth of knowledge of the history and personalities involved in this if I was just barely becoming involved in it as a result of this Redwoods video examination? And so we started comparing notes, and that was when it came out that this was his niece, that was my life. And he immediately reaches over, picks up the phone, and dials the number and says, "Mary." You'll never guess who's sitting across the room from me. And she still remembered. I mean, I was the first student that she lent that book out to, and the first one to actually show interest in her clipping file of the subject. So talk about a small world. I mean, it's either a small world or there is something to fate, and you're lining, because man, it seems, when you look back with 2020 hindsight, and it's like, I mean, I guess everybody, if you look back down your trajectory, it appears that things lined up, because that's just the way it ended up. But it was uncanny. It has been uncanny how things have repeatedly sort of lined themselves up and fallen into place to provide some really amazing opportunities to explore this subject. So there you go. There's a long answer to a simple question, but that's how it got started.
I like that answer. Yeah. Go ahead, Robert.
You probably ran into a whole bunch of people. I actually Sasquatch Legend Me Sinus. I've read it a few times. I use it as a resource book, and I was just looking through it to get ideas to talk to you about, questions to bring up, to try to keep things flowing along. Yeah. And you've met Paul Freeman.
Oh yeah. I spent time with him, visiting in his home and also out in the field several times. Of course, that, if you jump ahead, that's kind of the prologue answer, I guess, to the question, because there was a significant hiatus, and interest waxed and waned as other things vied for attention and competition. Girls came along there eventually, and then career, college, and so forth. Just trivial things like that, right?
Life.
But in any case, the real event was, there were a couple of things that again lined the dominoes up, but then one of them was having read Bigfoot of the Blues by Van Sorchard, and then being asked to write a book review on that. I became very familiar with all of the personalities and the timeline, the chronology there in the Blues as I digested this book and prepared to write a review. And I wanted to, Vance was a great journalist. He was a very talented writer and gift for wordsmithing and so forth. And it was an engaging book, but the question was, especially in this day and age, how accurate was the reporting? And so I wanted to talk to some of these people firsthand. And so I made a running list of some of the principals and asked him if he could provide me contact information. He was more than happy to do that. And so it was through that process that I had direct dialogue with not only Paul Freeman, but Wes Summerlin and Bill Lowry and some of these other people that played a prominent role in that narrative. And so again, circumstances, just a fluky kind of set of circumstances. I was home, was in February, so I don't know what the holiday was, but there was I don't think it was Valentine's Day, but in any case, we went out to visit my folks in Boise, where my extended family resides, and a couple of events had occurred. I had been involved in a documentary shoot with Richard Greenwell, and that involved the Redwoods video and so forth, and that was about to air, and chatting with the family. And I turned to my brother and I said, the wives were taken off to go on a shopping spree, and I said, hey, I've always wanted to visit with Grover. I bumped into Grover once at the physical anthropology meetings and didn't have a real opportunity. It was just a hello, how are you, more meet and greet type thing to visit about this topic. I said, what if he's available, he'll allow us, let's pop up there to Pullman. It's not too far a drive from Boise, and let's just make a little road trip, you and me, and we'll do an overnight, or we'll go up there and visit him and see what he's got. So it was great, and we went up, and Grover was very hospitable and cordial and accommodating. Spread out his casts, and was allowing me. I was videotaping. I was asking questions, and and all sorts of things. It was just really fascinating. I had already obviously devoured his book and was very cognizant that the footprints from the Blue Mountains, given their proximity to his hometown, played a very prominent role in his argument, his exploration of the subject matter from the perspective of footprint evidence. And so I was familiar with a lot of the examples he was pulling out, laying on the tables, and so when we were done with that, we were about to make our return trip back, and I said, let's take a little detour instead of coming straight down. I don't know what highway it is, through McCall, Idaho, that way. Let's do a little detour over through the Tri-Cities and down and over to Yakima, or we did not clear the Tri-Cities, but just sweep over to Walla Walla. We'll pass through Walla Walla and let's pay a surprise visit to some of these folks. We'll call ahead just a little bit, but literally it was on the spur of the moment, and we dropped into West Summerlin first and met him and his dear wife, Pee Wee, he calls her, Dorothy, because they're both quite short in stature. But then went over to Paul, and I tried to call ahead, but didn't reach him because it turns out he was up in the foothills driving around. And as we pulled up in front of his house, he was just pulling in. Well, it turns out, like I said, he was up running the roads. His habit was to run the foothill roads as soon as the snow began to melt off of those borderlands there, the farmland that butt right up against the national forest. And as he was, again, likewise, very cordial, inviting, let us in, and was very gracious to pull boxes out from his closet and start pulling casts out. And it was just amazing. It was one thing to have seen the replicas in Grover's collection, but here were the originals that those replicas were pulled from. And there's just something about an original cast. It just has it's almost as if there is a certain animation or aura to the original versus a replica. And man, they were just jumping off the floor at me, and I was pointing out details and asking questions. And he made the comment. He said, well, you obviously know a lot about footprints. Would you like to see some fresh tracks? And I go, what do you mean? Well, I found some this morning, just as you pulled up. That's where I was returning from. And I go, my job. Okay, well, yeah, sure. I mean, I was kind of incredulous. I didn't think the coincidence was realistic. But I looked at my brother, and we both nodded. I said, yeah, absolutely. So we went up, and it was just like I said, it wasn't way in the back country. It was just right. A place called 5 Points, but because of the convergence intersection of several roads, and basically something had walked across a fallow field and along a farm access road. And in that part of the country, the soil is very laden with this glacial loess. It's very fine, pulverized sediments, like flour almost. We have it here. There's a big swath of it across southeastern Washington and all of southern Idaho. I mean, around here we have deposits. I've done some work where we've done excavations for paleontology, and there'll be 3 meters, 4 meters of this loess in a section just accumulated, just blows around. Anyway, when it's wet, it creates a kind of clayey soil, and it really takes up detail. Well, I mean, this is why there have been so remarkable, almost unbelievably good footprints from the blues of southeastern Washington, northeastern Oregon. It's because of where the roads are cut and they're not improved, a lot of them. That's beginning to change, unfortunately, with gravel road beds being laid down. But for the longest time, they were just dirt. And so in the summer, they were powder kegs, basically, or powder, flour bins. And so anything that walked across left these remarkably pristine tracks. Or in the spring and fall, when they're wet, they form this really clay soil that holds remarkable detail, including dermatoglyphics, it seems. Examples, the best examples, the first examples to have attention drawn to them were from that region. Anyway, so we went up there. Make a long story short, we went up there, 15-inch footprints, not just one or two, a long line along this road, 35, 45 clear tracks in the soil. There's no room for ambiguity. They either were hoaxed by Freeman or someone hoaxing Freeman, or they were real. No misinterpretation, no whatever. And there's, someone looked at them and said, "Oh, these are bear tracks." Well, no, they're not bear tracks. I know bear tracks very well, and these are not bear tracks. They're either Bigfoot or they're fake. And a few of them popped out at me. One in particular showed a very distinctive ridge right across the instep, speed bump, hump. And because I have the background that I have, not only in a academic discipline that's very pertinent to this particular topic, but that I have some savvy of the history and chronology and publications on the subject. Immediately that image of the footprint photographed by Lyle Laverty on the film site jumped into mind, and there was remarkable parallel there. And that was the seed for the first, or for the formulation of this model of the Sasquatch foot that involved the mid-tarsal break. And so, I mean, that in itself was a stunning, outcome of that experience. But man, I was pinching myself because, it's like they were so clear. The animation, and as I knelt down, there was evidence of dermatoglyphics. Now, I have done experiments in the field, in my backyard, in the outdoors, in the elements. That's what I was grasping for. In the elements of how persistent that kind of detail is under various weather conditions. And these dermatoglyphics don't hang around very long. And the sharpness of the detail, the extrusion between the toes, the tension cracks, the pressure ridges, there were drag-ins, there were drag-outs, and so forth, comet tails. These had to have been literally under 6 to 8 hours old. So they were laid down the night before or in the wee hours of that morning, during the intervening night time. And my suspicion is, probably more detail than you want, but there's basically, I think it was out gleaning frozen fruit from these old abandoned pioneer orchards, plum and apple orchards, and that it was making its way back to go up this particular road we were on, went right up onto, I think it was called Black Snake Ridge, and then that drops over into the Mill Creek watershed, and the watershed abuts against the Wanahatukanan Wilderness. I mean, it's just a corridor, an uninterrupted corridor that goes right back into the roadless area. But and at this time of the year, it had melted back to those upper foothills, and then it was pretty patchy in places. I mean, you could traverse that stretch without too much trouble, especially if you were a 7.5-foot Sasquatch. And so, and I think a car, this would have been on a Saturday night, probably the first night that kids with their four-wheel drive, trucks or whatever, could get up that grade and back into the woods to mess around, and coming back late. And you could see the point where suddenly these tracks literally did a 180 and turned around. And as it was walking, every second right step was angled out 45 degrees as it looked over its shoulder. And then at some point, it just took off, and the stride length doubled. It ran down across the fallow field, and the tracks were really sinking in towards the only cover that was available right there to get out of the way of the headlights, and which was this, scrubby brush along the route of the drainage ditch that curled down around and went all the way back to the Mill Creek drainage. And it was very natural, very spontaneous. And Paul read it absolutely 180 degrees in reverse. He was a good outdoorsman and he knew his stuff, but he just hadn't he hadn't followed the tracks far enough to really identify the inflection points. He had it read just the opposite, that it was going the other direction, and apparently had curled back around because there were tracks going in both directions, but it was just the opposite. Anyway, I'm, like I said, I'm pinching myself thinking, how did he do this? And all the way home, my brother and I were talking about that. I mean, I was impressed enough. I turned to my brother after we took Paul home and dropped him off. I said, even if these are hoaxed, that it's extraordinary to have this extensive of a trackway to examine. Let's go back and take a closer look, but let's stop and grab some supplies. And we found a hardware store open on a Sunday afternoon in a small town, and got some plaster and some buckets and stirring sticks and whatnot, and went back up there. Really kind of literally flagged out each track, and determined the pathway, and made a series. I cast 7 footprints, not as ambitious as Cliff or who else did those huge long with hundreds of footprints, but
Yeah.
got a reasonable representation. And all the way home, we just, I kick myself now. We should have stayed. I mean, I could have had my brother drop me off at a car rental the next day, and he could have raced home to his job, and I could have made excuses for my absence. But there was still enough, but all the way home, we just talked about it, and how could he have done this? And what are the implications? I mean, that's just it. And that's, for some people, that's the hurdle. That's the hook, or the glitch, is if you acknowledge this piece of evidence that there might be something to it, then what's the implication downstream? There's actually, it's like I've described to other people. I always get a kick with it because it reminds me of this experience every time I see it. That seasonal commercial for M&Ms, when the 2 M&Ms come walking into the front room and there's Santa, and they both go, "He does exist." And Santa passes out. Sometimes you feel like passing out because man, it just hits you all of a sudden. A Sasquatch actually walked by here last night.
Yep.
kind of answered. And so anyway.
Well,
So
I guess. Yeah,
no, I was saying I like that analogy.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but I was just, since we're talking about Paul Freeman, there's like 3 other casts that I stumbled upon it, and you have them in your book as well. The Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, for those who haven't read it yet. It's a great book to read. I highly recommend it. But there's a knuckle print, a hand print, and a buttocks print.
Yes. Yeah.
You want to expand on those a little bit?
Yeah, the knuckle prints, Grover did some interesting description of that in his book, and they feature there. But one of the things that I've expanded upon in that is there's a couple things and that have happened. One is, whenever I looked at that, you can kind of see this part of, let me get in the camera, this part of the fingers, and it appears that it has a somewhat tapered finger. Now, and there's not an absolutely consistent, overwhelming case to be made one way or the other. If you look at the fingertips of great apes, because they're not tool users, that at least that has been the suggestion for why humans have rather broad fingertips, more pulpy fingertips, is the holding on to, especially the fine precision holding of structures for the construction or manufacture of tools. And so the bone, the distal phalanx, is much more shovel shaped, whereas that of a gorilla is more narrow, more spade, if you will, shaped. And those knuckle prints give the slight impression, I mean, the tips haven't touched in, obviously, but give the impression of being more tapered. But you've got this thumb that has this horrendously thick pad on the distal end. And that's always kind of sat as an incongruence in my mind. And then one day, it's just one of those things was back there. I'd never really addressed it in the book or elsewhere. And then one day a student was walking in, and it just happened that this was sitting on the counter, this cast, and the light from the window was coming in kind of low angle, and it was casting the shadow just right. And they looked at it and they go, "Oh, Dr. Meldrum, how come there's a ridge along the end of the thumb tip, the tip of the thumb there, running from the nail all the way across the end of this really thick pad?" I looked at that and the penny drops. And I go, "Oh my gosh, look at that. That ridge is the exact outline of the edge of the thumbnail." So this isn't just a imprint. The thumb, as the weight was pushed on that finger, the thumb went like that. And it gouged a wide imprint, and that edge of that corner of the thumbnail gouged a deeper trough right across. And so you know exactly how far the displacement was. And if you take that into account and allow then for the actual thickness of the thumb, it's not thick at all. It's not much different than looking at the end of your own thumb. That was really interesting. Then in terms of the thumb, there's a very clear demonstration. If you put your hand in that posture, our thumb kind of juts out in a particular direction because our thumb is rotated 90 degrees to better facilitate opposition, that precision grip. The great apes is rotated to a much lesser degree, if at all. And so, when their fingers flex, they mean the Sasquatch, I presume, I'm inferring, when their finger flexes, their thumb, which is actually facing the same direction, flexes in the same way and ends up pointing in exactly the same direction that you see on the knuckle prints. So, point being, the knuckle prints then suggest a non-opposable or a lesser opposable thumb than in a human. And that's actually quite consistent. There are other examples like the cast of the handprint that Bob Titmus made in that kind of wallow or that pond, and he tried to go up the steep muddy slope, and the hand sort of slid down the mud. And if you look, you get the long elongated digits as it slides, but then there's that final imprint, and the thumb pad is facing directly down towards the ground instead of turned 90 degrees as yours or mine would. So it seems to be consistent. So that says something I think is quite interesting, which is also consistent with the profile of Sasquatch behavior that we can infer. That is the total lack of a tool culture of stone tools other than opportunistic, wielding of branches or sticks or pitching rocks or something, which is the same thing that other great apes are quite capable of doing. So now please don't peg me. I'm not saying Sasquatch is a great ape. I'm using an analogy here to compare and elucidate the anatomy. If you want to tackle that topic, we certainly can, and just explore the arguments pro and con on and just what the words mean. But so that's one. Then when I was writing the book, this is really kind of an interesting little aside. Paul, when I acquired his collection, there was amongst the collection this odd looking thing, which he had labeled as in little air quotes, kind of toes. And when we were going through the whole thing and repacking it before I brought it back to my lab, the whole collection, I was looking at this and I was asking about it. He goes, "Yeah, I don't know what to make of that." I just called it toes. It just looked like a funny little series of indentations. Well, when I was writing the chapter on butt prints and foot and hand prints and other non-footprints, I pulled open the drawer at one point. I was looking for a different specimen, and I saw that again, and I'm looking at it. But now I've got hands on my brain, and it's suddenly the penny dropped. The connection was made. It was a fist. I was looking at the knuckles. If I can do it here without dropping my computer, I was looking at the knuckles, but you can see this fleshy part of the heel of the palm, and then up here, and as it pushed off with that fist, it sort of rolled, and the knuckles left a series of imprints, 4 of them, as it rolled, kind of. And once you see it, it's like, how could I have missed that? But it's so subtle. Paul didn't recognize it. I didn't recognize it at first. And then when we were first there, when my brother and I were first at Paul's place, amongst the casts, you pointed out, there's one, the infamous butt print. And he
tell me about that one.
he pulled that out, and I couldn't restrain a little chuckle. I go, what is that? And I knew what it looked like, but I wanted to hear him. And he said, yeah. He says, well, all I can tell you is I followed these tracks. He said, these 15-inch tracks, I followed them, and it apparently stepped over a bank, and then it looks like it sat back down, and before getting up and leaving and going away. He said, I don't know if it goes, he's turning this thing upside down. I don't know if it goes this way or that way. And I'm looking at it as an anatomist would look at it, and I go, well, I said, there's the tailbone, the coccyx, we call it, right there, as plain as day. And just below the coccyx, there's a nice little tightly puckered sphincter. The detail is there. It was a really fine sand, a silty sand. And so it picked it. I mean, you can see it's in exactly the right spot. And then, here are the butt cheeks, and you can see this coarse hair streaming down. The hair imprint actually shows up in the imprint. And then the skin on, this is called the natal cleft, the smile there. That's the natal cleft, and the hair or the skin looks hairless right there. And if you come down, there's not a real obvious scrotum. We don't know. I don't know that anyone has ever made comments. There have been some comments about the male genitalia, but I don't know that anyone has ever commented about seeing testicles. And we don't know. I would suspect, given the comparative anatomy of the great apes as correlated with their social structure, that if Sasquatch is large and solitary, doesn't defend a harem, or doesn't compete with other males for the access to proximate females, instead hangs out like in a male orangutan, defending the territory, waiting for a receptive female to look for his companionship, that the testicles probably are pretty modest. That's the strategy. If you're a bonobo that live in a free love commune system where access is pretty egalitarian, and so basically the way you ensure that your progeny has representation in the next generation is that they grow these humongous testicles. I mean, they're gigantic. They're ridiculously gigantic. So you outcompete by volume, basically, by numbers. Whereas the orangutan, which, when you're the biggest, baddest guy on the block, the women just line up. But that's not very often. That's only once every 4, 5, 6, 7 years. The huge birth interval. And so, you have a nice, compact, streamlined version that gets the job done just fine. And without all the other headaches that come with it. So anyway, I'm being facetious a little bit here, but yeah, it's a Sunday, right? So I can take my time.
Yes.
So the point is, there's no obvious evident scrotum. It doesn't have a really prominent gap, though. I mean, there's no space there. But see, with a Sasquatch female giving birth to a small-brained offspring, there isn't the obstetric constraint that a human female would have. Instead, so you don't get the exaggeration of the distance between the hips in order to accommodate an enlarged birth canal, is the point. Plus, if this were a human, males and females carry a fair amount of adipose tissue on our backsides, and so even when the underlying muscular infrastructure there is good and toned and firm, when we sit down on a hard surface, it pushes that fat around, and instead of a gaping space between the butt cheeks, we have just a line. It presses together. But in this case, you get the impression of not a lot of adipose tissue necessarily, and a rather muscular gluteus maximus, such that there is a gap, with only the slightest hint of perhaps the labia, the vulva of a female. And then you got the fold separating the butt cheek from the back of the thigh. And on the back of the thigh is pretty coarse hair again, streaming in a downward direction like it should. And so it's, I mean, for someone to be audacious enough to go to the trouble of artistically scoping. I mean, I could just imagine him out there, with a big spoon, scooping out and smoothing out. But to have the wherewithal to get all those little subtle details. I mean, this is the clincher. People are critical of the stuff that Paul Freeman has documented, but it contains, again, not because of him. I mean, the credit that goes to him is that he was out there all the time. This became his obsession, and every free minute he'd be out there driving those roads. And again, like I said, the conditions where he frequented were such that they were ideal for finding long lines of tracks and multiple examples of tracks. But beyond that, the subtleties of anatomy that are present in the documented tracks that he has, the details, again, not surprising given the conditions, but certainly he was not capable of incorporating those kinds of details. I would sit and explain as I was pointing out details in the tracks that he showed me. And this is no disrespect intended to Paul, but I'd kind of wax technical in my descriptions, and you could see it was just, he'd nod politely, but he didn't know what I was talking about. And that's the case. I mean, that's again nothing against Paul or in particular, but I don't think he was capable of pulling that off. I really don't. So yeah, those prints don't get as much attention as obviously as some of the more popular or well-known footprints, but they're remarkably revealing about some subtleties of anatomy.
Yeah.
So
I really want to. Sorry, Robert.
So if you take that, that's okay. Wait, I can't see your lips moving. It's. I'm trying to get the opportunity. So if you take that butt print, could you estimate, or do you care to, how tall the individual would have been to leave a butt print that size?
Well, yeah.
Or is that even possible?
He used up his plaster on the butt print, but he reported that footprints associated were just under 15 inches in length. And so, and that's one of the things I was going to say too. When you watch the Patterson-Gimlin film, it's like, let's take one further step. When you watch Harry and the Hendersons, Harry and the Hendersons in the final scenes, when Harry goes off into the woods, if you stop and grab those frames and look, you'll see Harry's missing a very fundamental feature of anatomy. Harry has no butt crack. He has pants. He's wearing pants. There is no definition to his butt cheeks at all. I mean, it's just because that's just, it's not something that comes lock and stock with. I mean, to do that, you would have to have very form-fitting spandex costume or four-way stretch fur. And obviously in 1967, there was no four-way stretch fur. There was only fur cloth. And so, if you look at the Patterson-Gimlin film towards the front, amongst the frames when Roger is running across the creek and the thing is gyrating up and down, there's one pass where there's a frame or two, one frame in particular, that catches Patty fairly close to the camera at about a 3/4 posterior view. And it's actually in remarkable clarity. There's very minimal motion blur. I mean, it's just the coincidence, I guess, the shutter and his position of his arm. But you can see the butt crack as clear as day. And you can see the definition of these massive gluteals. Now, I don't know whether, especially in October, whether she maybe had more adipose tissue laid down. I think that they've got to stoke up a little bit with extra calories to put on some weight. I don't know if they hibernate for sure. I suspect probably that they do, or at least have periods of inactivity, extended periods of inactivity, for which they do kind of bulk up a bit and live off of some of those stores. So, what you see on Patty and this bears on some of the controversy about whether you can see the gluteals contract or not in the film, whether the shortening is just pushing of the padding up, or whether it's actually the muscle contracting, or whether it's the muscle contracting under a rather immobile pad of adipose tissue, instead of PGA. You look at those African native women that display that adaptation of storing fat in the breasts and in the buttock for lean times. Once that fat's laid down, there's connective tissue to give it some form and rigidity, so it's not just a water bag. It doesn't move with the kind of animation that the contraction of a muscle belly will exhibit. And so it's hard to know with Patty whether, her muscles are so well defined everywhere else that if she does have a little extra adipose tissue, I would suspect that would be one place where it might be deposited and packed. So given our legacy and so forth. So anyway, but there's a remarkable coincidence when you look at that. So let me back up. The 15-inch tracks, I think, is what he claims were associated. So not much different than Patty, and the contours and everything doesn't look that much different than Patty. So, I put Patty at probably just under 7 feet, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 feet myself, and my estimation. So I would think that the butt print correlates well with that. Maybe just a tad bigger than Patty, not by much.
Yeah. What time of year was the butt print? Do you remember?
Offhand, I can't say.
Okay.
As the time, there was a time when I had all that stuff down pretty well, but things a little.
I need to get a copy of that butt print so bad.
Yeah, well, it's the mold I had pretty much is fried, so it's doable, but I would have to manufacture another mold for it to do it. Terrible to ship, though. That's the problem. Unless you come and buy for a visit, I've shipped one or two, and I packed it up really well, and it survived the shipping, but it was extremely expensive to ship.
I'll just have to come up and get one.
Yeah, there you go. Well, then you get the whole tour too.
Oh, that would be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. Hey, there's a few other prints that are out there, and you kind of touched upon some already, but I'm always fascinated by the Bosberg Cripplefoot one.
Yeah.
Whether somebody could go out and fake it, and then Grover Krantz put all those bones inside and made it make sense.
That's right. Yep. So Grover was that was actually the cast that tipped the scale for Grover, at least in his public declarations. That he and it also made a huge impression on John Napier. In John Napier's book, he was one of the few primatologists, anthropologists at that time to adopt at least somewhat of an open mind and exhibit some objectivity. There's some mistakes in his book and so forth that were, I think, the result of the paradigms at the time, as well as his limited access to footprints casts. He was working probably with a dozen specimens or so. I've got 300 in my laboratory to base these generalizations upon, so it makes a difference. But still, it was the footprints. Napier concluded he was convinced the Sasquatch exists because something had to be leaving those footprints. And he drew some of his distinctions between human-like and hourglass shape were not justifiable, in my opinion. That the distinctions he was drawing were more expressions of differences of individuals and differences of substrate interaction with different substrate qualities, like whether it was in soft snow or mud versus a hard pan underlying road dust or whatever. But he's the one who made the comment that he could hardly imagine someone being so knowledgeable and so sick to depict such a deformity. But it is fascinating. I've had the opportunity to visit with a number of clinicians. In fact, I was invited to speak years ago at Massachusetts General Hospital, and to the entire podiatry and there were the orthopedics department was invited. It was sponsored by the podiatry department, but there were, it was a room full of 7,500 people. That even foot doctors from around the community came to the talk. And so it provided an opportunity to not only talk about the biomechanics and the modeling of the Sasquatch foot as exemplified in numerous cases, but to showcase this clinical case, this clinical note of this deformity to these people. And they were just, they were amazed. They were really engaged in the questions afterward. And I actually had brought along a sampling of footprint casts so they could actually, because, there's just something about holding those physical objects in your hand as you're considering this anatomy. But and I had the pair, the Bosberg pair, which I donated to the department chair, and they were on display for a long time. I don't know if they still are in the department office there in the hospital, in the Massachusetts General Hospital. So that says something. See, the clinicians don't have the baggage. Remember, we talked about the implications creating a hurdle. For them, they're just looking at the pathology and trying to diagnose it, trying to evaluate it as if it were a patient. Here's a good one. When I had a distant cousin who another Meldrum who I bumped into in college, and he was a couple of years my senior. He went on to medical school and became an orthopedic surgeon. And when I had appeared on a couple of documentaries, he got motivated and looked me up and contacted me, reached out. We had a really interesting conversation. I said, "Hey, can I send you something?" I said, I've always wanted to have someone with your background give me your opinion of a set of casts. And he said, "Well, sure." So there's that excellent black and white photo that's taken of the Bosberg pair. It has 2 yardsticks lay there, and it's been published in several different formats. But I sent him a copy of that, and he immediately phoned back, and he said, "This is really interesting." He said, the normal foot is fairly typical of human anatomy, human-like anatomy. He said the heel is rather elongated and rather wide, but otherwise it's fairly normal. He said, but this other foot, he said, this is a classic case of, and he delved into the possible interpretation of the anatomy. And we went kind of back and forth and discussed that. And he said, if I was presented with a patient, he said, this is almost certainly a spinal cord lesion, like a tumor on the spinal cord, which causes an effect that goes downstream down the nerves, a neuropathy, which then affects the soft tissue. It can cause hypertrophy or constriction, contracture rather, of the soft tissue and muscles that pull the joints out of alignment. He said, if it were a congenital pathology, one from birth, we would usually expect that then it to express on both feet. But just on one side, he said, if a patient came in, especially if it's an adult like this, he said, I would immediately send them for an MRI evaluation of their spine, of their spinal cord. He said, now where and when these were taken. There must be, just a single hospital in that region. This was back before FERPA, so you could, or HIPAA, or whichever it is now. I don't remember which federal regulations it is, but he goes, couldn't you go and ask, for someone with a foot deformity and a spinal cord lesion? And I said, well, I might consider undertaking that, but you do realize that the person would have to have 17.5-inch feet. And there was this pregnant pause on the other end of the line. And then he goes, "Oh, you're right. You're right." I mean, he was so distracted by the anatomy that he ignored the fact that there were 2 yardsticks right there in the picture. And he goes, "Oh, you're right." Right. So we talked a little more, but then about 3 weeks later, I get a phone call, and his associate, who was actually the foot specialist. My cousin Russell specialized actually in knee and hip replacements in the group that he was practicing with. But the foot specialist, who'd been out of town, had returned, and the conversation obviously had turned to this. And so he got in touch with me. We talked for about an hour, and all about the ins and outs, about the nuts and bolts of what it might or might not be, and what that might mean. And then he said, this is the kicker. He said, I hope you don't mind. He said, I kind of imposed on your cousin Russell to let me have that photo that you sent. He said, I got it framed and it hangs in my office, and about every 2 or 3 months when I get a new set of residents, this is the first case I have them evaluate. I mean, it's that satisfying, it's that acceptable, it's that conventional of an expression of a pathology that it's not common, but that occurs in humans. You know, there's a whole constellation because there's so many potential maladies. You've got so many bones packed into the ankle, the tarsus, that there's a lot can go wrong. But yeah, he was absolutely fine with it. And as I started to say, he didn't have the burden to then accommodate the implication of it being real, and there actually being a creature out there with a 17.5-inch foot, you know. So for them, it was just an interesting curiosity and really fascinating. So Grover had inferred the morphology, or the skeletal morphology, based on some of the features and the landmarks. And this is something, I really want to stress this too, because there's been a lot said about it, and a lot of disregard, disrespect for Grover and his comments on this topic. First of all, you can absolutely infer the position of bones based on surface anatomy of the foot. You know, the point of greatest convexity on the forefoot below the big toe marks the position. There's a tight correlation to the position of the helical metatarsal phalangeal joint, that joint in the ball of the foot. You can look on the outer edge of the foot, and you can see where the head of the fifth metatarsal is. You can see a prominence usually, and that depends on how much fatty tissue that might be masking some of the underlying bony landmarks. But you can see the base that has a prominent tuberosity. And then most people, if you look at their wet footprint or their imprint in the sand, there's another bulge right behind there that marks the position of the calcaneal-cuboid joint. And because it has its shape combined with the soft tissue that makes up the joint capsule, it has a bit of a bulge right there. If the person has flat feet and their arch is pressed downward, there's a very prominent tuberosity on the navicular, the bone just in front of the ankle bone on the inside of the foot. And in a person that's flat-footed, there'll be a convexity, a bulge that corresponds with that. You can identify these things. You know, Dr. Daglin, again, one time challenged me to do a study where, do a blind study where we would combine the x-rays of the subject with their footprints in the sand pit, say, and then have, draw a correlation. Try to infer blindly those points, and then correlate with the x-ray and measure your margin of error. Well, that could be done. First of all, though, it's become more problematic because to have all these healthy subjects submit to an otherwise unnecessary x-ray of their foot is now become a problem. When I was a graduate student, we just line up all the graduate students and do it. You can't do that anymore. But the point is, you can, anyone can do this. Just Google foot x-ray and look at the images that come up. And there are many examples where the dose, the strength of the x-ray is just right, so that you get a good image of the skeleton and a nice halo of the soft tissue. And so you have the outline of the foot. Now, sometimes the foot they're not in a weight-bearing position. They may be pointed up in the air, and that's going to change some of the outline details just a little bit. But you can see these points that I've described, and they're they're present, they're evident, and the ability to infer that just comes with some practice and some familiarity with the associated anatomy. So that's the first thing. Second thing is that's often misstated is that Grover, he chose his words poorly. He was trying to describe the fact that given the great size of the Sasquatch, that one way to accommodate that mass in the mechanical system of the foot is to increase the heel length. You increase the lever, the input lever, and so that's very straightforward. But unfortunately, he described it as shifting the ankle forward. So people had in mind that there was somehow this translation of the shin bone so that it was attaching to the foot in a different place. Well, no, that's not it. It's just the position relative to the length of the foot as measured from the heel to the toes is different because the heel segment is longer, and that displaces the calcaneal tendon, the Achilles tendon, back further from the shin bone, which also, Grover talked about that was what he was referring to when he talked about the Patterson film subject having apparently thick ankles. It's because if you displace that tendon back farther, there's just dead space in between them. It's got adipose tissue and other loose connective tissue in there. There's a neurovascular bundle that comes down one side behind the ankle, but it has that space. That also explains the observation, again, which Dagling erroneously points out in his book, that the apparent projection of an ostensibly false heel when the foot is lifted. Well, if you have this long projecting heel with a tendon which experiences some slack if the calf muscles are not firing against resistance, as in when the foot is swinging through the air, that slack tendon makes the heel look more prominent. Soon as weight is born and the calf muscles are taut, that ligament becomes stretched tight and you have a straight line right down to the heel. And if you would just look at some other frames in the film, it's obvious. You see that. It's obvious. So anyway, Grover's reconstruction was really quite insightful. He recognized that the bunionettes, the bulges on the outside of the foot, almost certainly corresponded to the two principal joints on the outside of the foot, between the calcaneus and the cuboid and the fifth metatarsal. And because that foot was bent, if you take a broad foot and you bend it, the outer edges are going to be pulled apart. And that strain and trauma pathology of the joint causes an inflammation. And just like when grandma's toe gets pushed in by her tight, pointy grandma shoes, you get a bunion right at the base of the toe. A bunion. So that's a bunion. Same thing. The joint's deranged, gets swollen and irritated and bulges out on the outside edge of the foot. When that occurs, we call it a bunionette, just for distinction. All right. So the placement is pretty clear. And that was what he was pointing out. If you see that condition in a human, which you can find examples of, it appears that they're further back towards the back of the foot. Why? Because the heel is not as long. Humans have actually greatly shortened their heel because our input lever has incorporated the forefoot. We have a stiff arch. So now the foot doesn't bend in the instep, it bends down at the ball of the foot, at the base of our toes. So we can afford to make the heel shorter, which makes a speed lever rather than a force lever. That is, we give up some of the force of a long lever so that a little bit of displacement of that short heel translates into a lot of displacement of the distal foot, which is an advantage in running. And we're lean, mean running machines. That's our primary adaptation, locomotor adaptation is modern humans. So Grover got that right. The one thing I think that he was a little off the mark on was simply this. He had not appreciated at that point the significance of the midfoot flexibility and the impact that would have not only on the heel segment, but on the transmittal of forces through the forefoot. Humans have experienced a dramatic selection for shortening of the toes to prevent the bending stresses on long curved digits when we toe off. So our toes are remarkably short compared to a chimp or a gorilla. And if Sasquatch walked just like us with an arched foot, its toes would experience those things only many times over, given its mass. So he thought the toes would be even shorter. But in reality, the mid-tarsal pressure ridge allows for the push-off to come not through the toes, but through the entire forefoot. And the toes then are spared those bending stresses and can retain a much greater flexion, prehensile function. And so there were some inconsistencies, when I looked at the outline of those imprints and the potential position of a flexion crease and so forth, I couldn't reconcile that with his toes. But if I made the toes longer to fit those features, boom, the Bosberg foot suddenly had toes the same length as every other reconstruction I had done. And you can see it in the Patterson-Gimlin film. There's that frame where the foot's swinging forward and the toes point up towards the sky. Yep. They're huge. They're long. They're not the little peas in the pod that Renee DeHinden wanted you to believe or advocated. They look that way from the sole because the sole pad extends quite some distance up under the toes. Now, I'm waxing way too technical, perhaps, but I want you, even if you don't, even if not everyone follows all those anatomical details, I mean, I hope that you will take away from that the realization that I can sit and have conversations about this anatomy with people who are technically astute about it, with a room full of orthopedic surgeons and podiatrists, and they're going like this. Yeah, that's right. That makes sense. That makes absolute sense. And then, if I translate some of that towards people who are in the know with anthropologists about the evolutionary history, some of them are going, and some of them are going, no, this can't be. They can't exist, therefore they don't exist. That's what those count. Can't exist, therefore they don't exist. But the detail, the substance, the science, we're hearing that word a lot on the news now. The science tells us that these are worth considering. This is good evidence. This isn't just a bunch of spurious fakes, simple facsimiles of human feet enlarged, Mullins blocky carved planks. There's not. It's not. Ray Pickens, that's what kills me is, the Bosberg tracks will be attributed to Ray Pickens, who's appeared on camera with his fake feet. Well, if anyone would stop just for a moment, and I've done this in presentations, just do some frame grabs from that interview and take that foot that he says that he created the Bosberg tracks with and hold it up to the tracks. I mean, there's no comparison. It's just like saying the Ray Mullins, carved feet that he whittled out with a lumber axe, basically could account for the Bluff Creek tracks. It's just
no.
Oh, sorry. I'll let you go ahead and ask another question.
No problem. It's still talking about tracks. So let's take the average squatcher out in the field. They're out for a hike. They see a nice soft spot of dirt or some mud, and they see a track. What features, without giving away your trade secrets, what features, what should they look for to let them know that that's not a human track?
Right. Well, of course, the first thing is size range. Now, all Sasquatch aren't born with 15, 16, 17-inch feet. Obviously, there's a growth curve, but there are some telltale human signs, and we've alluded to one. The Sasquatch seems to be characterized by a flat, flexible foot. The flatness avoids concentrating pressure under the points of contact of that arch. And the manner of walking, instead of having a heel strike where you have all that force coming down on just that heel pad, that narrow, tiny heel pad, you have it dispersed over a much wider area. And to further help with that challenge, the foot is wider. So it's much wider. When you see these really narrow tapered heels, I've seen fakes where someone will use a human foot, they'll step in there, and then you get the swim fin effect where they angle out the end of it or continue it out longer, but they haven't done anything with the heel. And that's immediate giveaway. You wouldn't have a 16-inch foot with a 3-inch heel. A 16-inch foot has a 7 or 8-inch forefoot and a 5 or 6-inch heel. Then the arch has a very distinctive appearance in the human foot. It has in my field guide, I draw it kind of, it's like almost like a question mark. You almost get this little button hook. With the arch, you get a very differentiated ball of the foot that is specifically, and some people use the ball to describe the area under all the metatarsal heads. I typically restrict it to the first metatarsal at the big prominent fleshy bit right at the base of the big toe. And so when you look at the outline, it kind of hooks around of the arch, it hooks around that ball and then does a kind of a button hook. If you know about football patterns, it comes back and then encircles the heel. That's usually a very distinctive trait. Now it depends on there's going to be variation depending on the mobility, the height of the arch, et cetera, et cetera. Also combined with that, the human toes and the Sasquatch toes have very distinctive look. The human big toe pad is remarkably large by comparison to the second, third, fourth, fifth. Whereas the Sasquatch, it can have a good sized big toe pad, but they're more approaching being subequal. In other words, the other toes aren't, they're not as small relative to the big toe as is the case in human. And then of course now one of the things that sometimes throws that for a little bit of a loop are these fingered shoes, because those give the toes a different proportionality and different shape, a little more kind of quadrangular shape instead of a nice, but usually the sole of a fingered shoe will have some sort of logo, some sort of tread pattern, but there are individuals that have rather worn shoes and those get smoothed off a bit. But they have a very distinctive look, and all it takes is if you just spend some time on Google and look at various advertisements for these fingered shoes, and you get a sense of the appearance that they convey. The one real tell that is good most of the time, not always. Some people just naturally, they've worn more sensible shoe wear and they have more splaying ability of their toes. But that little pinky toe, because of shoe wear, very frequently gets quite compressed against the other digits. In fact, a lot of times, someone takes off their shoes and walks across the snow or walks across the mud. You can see the outline of their foot by the outline of their foot that they have worn shoes, and the toes are just packed in there like grapes in a crate. But the little toe can sometimes get turned over completely on its side, so it actually leaves a nail imprint on the outside edge, and that's always a dead giveaway. If you see a good splay, then and it's bigger, et cetera, other details. So, and that's you make a good point about revealing trade secrets. I don't think there's that many people who have so much time on their hands and are so they're not quite to sociopathic, I guess, but they're not again, they were probably the ones that weren't very good players on the playground, community players on the playground when they were little. But I don't think there's that many that do that. What we end up with more often than not is people reading too much into a footprint they find. And it seems that there are people who go out in what seem to be odd circumstances to be barefoot and walk or run around barefoot. I mean, first of all, these people who flood my web or my Facebook page with images of footprints in drawn down reservoirs where there's huge mud flats. And it's still a little precarious proposition to have a toddler out walking in mud in the bottom of a lake. I mean, there could be fish hooks, there could be bottles, there could be who knows what, sticks and stones, and but that's more attractive, I guess, to walk around in that squishy mud, feel that between your toes. But if all you're finding are footprints that have all the characteristics that I just described and that are only in the 8, 9, 10 inch range or smaller, anything above 11 inches, you're in the less than 1% of the human population. So these NBA basketball players that have feet that are 14, 15 inches long, they are rare. They are in a exclusive club, a very limited membership club. You look at the bell curve, and I just prepared a graphic for one interview I did not too long ago. A paper had come out just recently. 1.5 million people's feet were measured, were collected. Data was collected from 3 principal ethnicities across the globe, including Asians and Caucasians and so forth, and shown. The curves were shown separately, so you could see, as you might expect, on average, Asians are a little bit shorter than Western, the Americans and Western Europeans. But none of them, all 3 of the curves tailed out right at 11 inches, almost zeroed out. And so that's a pretty good benchmark, I think. So if all you're finding are footprints in that range, and there's no basis to distinguish them from human characteristics, I don't care where you're finding them. They were on the top of Mount Everest. It still was some crazy kook who took his shoes off and walked around barefoot, in my estimation, because walks like a duck.
It quacks like a duck.
Like a
duck.
That's pretty
talking
funny.
about the feet a little bit more. Have you found pronation, supination, or walking in a straight line, fox walking? Have you seen any of those correlations associated
right.
with
I honestly think that the walking in a straight line is a little bit overstated. But certainly there are advantages, and if anyone has spent time in the field, has spent time trekking along game trails, that's the way you walk, because that's the only place you can plant your feet without getting tangled in the undergrowth and so forth and deadfall. And also, if you are carrying a weight, if anyone's a backpacker out there, especially if you're faced with a little more of an incline, you'll find that if you place your feet more midline, you take some of the pressure off of the abductors, the muscles in your hips that help to balance your torso over the support limb. So if you can put that support limb angled in a little further, we already have adaptations that do that. And any bipedal animal, like a Sasquatch would, or an early hominin, is going to have those same characteristics where the femur angles in towards the midline. That's the valgus angle of the femur. So the knee is further in than the hip. That's going to also tend to place your feet more in line with one another. Okay, then the degree of supination and pronation. Now, basically, what that refers to, people are usually familiar with the term pronation. If you have an individual that is, say, a little obese or has a tendency for knock-kneed posture, then their ankle tends to roll inward and it pushes the arch down. And those people tend to have, because of the excessive weight, have collapsed arches again, the soft tissue is not designed really to support that excessive body weight, and eventually there's some failure that shows up. Supination is just the opposite. Supination is the twisting of the long axis of the foot in such a way that the arch is heightened, is elevated, exaggerated. Now, given the range, humans with healthy arches have a much restricted range of motion in the joints of the instep that are involved, that move during those movements of supination and pronation. So even a normal healthy arched foot can show that, and you can see that. I use in my demonstrations an illustration from a textbook where the subject was asked to walk. He had their feet were colored in paint, and then they were asked to walk on a strip of paper and consciously walk knock-kneed and try to force their arches down. And then in the next one, they were told to walk with their knees sort of angled out and more putting their weight more on the outer edge of their foot. And so you could see that the range of motion in one normal healthy individual, and it was there. You could see the distinction between the two sets of tracks. If Sasquatch has a flat, flexible foot, then and the ability to for this mid-tarsal break, as is expressed in something say like a chimpanzee, then and you can see this on the joints of the chimpanzee, the joint surfaces, even on the skeleton, you can infer the greater range of motion, say between the head of the talus, the head of the ankle bone, and the navicular, which forms a little ball and socket joint. But in humans, it has a very limited range of motion, and that joint surface only extends up on the head a little ways. But in the chimpanzee, it goes way past where it goes in the human, because the foot can bend much further at that joint. And I would suspect that the Sasquatch foot more resembles that, given that greater range of motion. Their expression of the differences in supination and pronation can be much more dramatic. Now, there was a case, this was an interesting, where this really came into a little sharper focus with a specific example. But when Finding Bigfoot came to Pocatello for one of their shoots, and they did a very brief, almost gratuitous visit to my lab. It didn't spend much time, but it gave Cliff the opportunity, when he was freed up in the afternoon before going out and doing his solo gig in the woods, he spent the whole afternoon in my lab and was just rifling through things. And it was great to have someone really appreciate and go through and take advantage of that. He calls me out of my office at one point, and he said, "Jeff, what about these two?" And he had two prints from the Blue Mountains, one that was cast by Paul Freeman, one that was cast by Wes Summerlin, and had them side by side. And he said, "Aren't these the same individual?" And I said, "Well, I've often thought that, but I've often kind of held it in the back of my mind, because there are some individuals," and this was Renee again, who made a great big deal about any variation in the angle of the toe row. If the toes were disposed more squarely across the end of the foot in one step, but more angled in the other step, then he took exception to that. That can't happen, So I just, I wasn't quite sure. And I said, but, because if you looked at these, the one that was cast by Paul Freeman, it almost looked like it had an arch. The medial side of the foot was raised up a bit. The foot was a little bit curved, because of that twisting. And the toe row was much more angled. But then there was, I'm sorry, I've got that backward. The toe row looked like it was more squared across the end of the foot. The Wes Summerlin cast was just as flat as could be, very pronated, straight axis of the foot, and a rather steep toe row. Not steep, but steeper than the other example. But when you looked at the big toe, which had this massive pad, this individual had a really big toe, and the other toes were significant as well, quite long and prominent. There wasn't a lot of webbing up between the toes. So these are, again, going back to Renee called, these individuals, especially from the blues, that didn't have a lot of padding up under the toes, that left just the toe tips looking like peas in a pod, he called them sausage toes and thought that was a sign that they were fake. See? Well, and the little toe, as opposed to being curled under with shoe wear, like I described, flared out almost at a like a crescent in the opposite direction. And the shape of the little toe was absolutely identical in the two. So I thought, well, again, suddenly someone asked the right question in the right circumstance and the penny drops. And I said, well, let's assume they are, if they are, then the toes don't change positions. So the toes have to be in the same place. And you take the one and you rotate it until the toes lined up, and boom, now the forefoot edges lined up perfectly. The only difference between the two casts was in the angle of the heel segment. Well, that's exactly, when you pronate, the heel is lined up with the forefoot. When you supinate, the forefoot and the heel are at a decided inclination, angle, rather. I mean, it was just like, boom. So you ask for a smoking gun. There's no way that Paul Freeman or Wes Summerlin could incorporate that kind of detail. I mean, even if they were ignorant of the terminology and so forth, and the underlying mechanism. Because, I mean, the point of inflection, too, was exactly in the right position, proportionality-wise, between the heel segment and the fore segment that I have suggested based on numerous examples, like the Bosberg cripplefoot with the bunionettes that show where one of those joints is located, if that's right, versus what else is it? The position of the mid-tarsal pressure ridge, which indicates where those joints are. They have to be right in front of that pressure ridge where the material's pumped back into the space, voided by the elevated heel. There's just no way. And there's multiple examples. I mean, that's not the only one, but so we touched on a bunch of different things. We touched on sausage toes. We touched on all kinds of things, but it's hard to sweep up the not that I don't want to say messes. It's hard to correct the misstatements, accumulate, and then it's like throwing feathers in the wind. They take on a life of their own, and they get repeated over and over again.
Yeah.
And to a point too where now there's enough. I mean, I've lived long enough and been in this long enough to see some of the loss of institutional memory, because there's a new generation of enthusiasts that are really getting involved and active, but they don't have a full appreciation of the history. And so unfortunately they get online and they glom onto some things and they start repeating them, or you see it when there'll be a picture or a blob squatch that has been hashed and rehashed time and time again, but a new set of viewers, and everyone has to have their own journey of discovery, and I don't begrudge that, but hold some of your convictions in a tentative position until you really understand the history of
I hear you on that.